Hey everybody, welcome to the next installment of Journey Through John. Today we continue on with the story that we started yesterday with the man who was healed by the pool of Bethesda. It was a man who'd been lame for 38 years, and Jesus found him and then healed him. The problem that many people ran into in the story is that he did this on the Sabbath. So the religious leaders now are talking to the man who had just been healed and will soon go after Jesus. It's interesting with that is, for a point of reference, is that the religious leaders at the time we often point to and say, well, those were the bad guys of the Bible, the Pharisees and Sadducees and other religious leaders. The reality is that they weren't bad people, but they were misguided. And so they weren't necessarily the bad guys. They were just the confused people and misled. So keep that in mind, because I believe it'll have an impact on our challenge today. But having said that, let's keep this short and let's get to verse 10 and start reading through this. It says this: So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "Well, the man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, the interesting piece in this, just to kick things off, is this guy was just healed and he was carrying his bed just as Jesus had commanded him. And so now the Jewish officials were saying, Jewish religious leaders were saying, you're not allowed to carry your bed. It's the Sabbath. And even beyond that, that Jesus healed on the Sabbath. They were focusing so much on the law that they were missing the act of God that was taking place. They're nitpicking into things as opposed to seeing this guy who was lame for 38 years up and walking and able to carry the bed. Not struggling, but strongly carrying the bed. And this is just one piece that we see with the religious leaders missing the point. And as we think through all this, the Pharisees, when we look, and the religious leaders of the time, they were good, but they were misled. And they'd rather keep the law than have God, truly have God work in this man's life and see transformation and see him healed. They didn't like Jesus for that. When we look at this, when we see the teaching of Jesus, we see that he healed this man, not just for a sign, but to see restoration and to point people to God. And then the Pharisees, they didn't really like that. They kind of felt maybe that they were losing some power. They were okay with Jesus healing, but just to do it on the Sabbath maybe. Keep it within the parameters of what we're used to. And I wonder, when we see these types of things, it challenges me to say, with these religious leaders gotten off track and been misled, and I know I've alluded to this stuff before, but I want to be very cautious and careful that we who are the followers of Jesus now are following Jesus truly and not being misled and following some other strand of this and being misled like the Pharisees and Sadducees were of their time. It causes me to wonder, how off are we? And when we spend time, are we really trying to spend time in the Word and finding people that we truly trust will keep the Word of God pure? And are we entrusting them to teach us and lead us through this? It's very important for us to hold on to the purity of who Jesus is. And I wonder how many unnecessary things we add to our faith, the Christian faith. And do we operate, and I think we oftentimes we can operate even too heavily maybe in the grace side or too heavily in the truth side, and we become legalistic or we become a little bit too free and liberal with the gospel. The reality is that there's a balance of truth and grace. There is truth, and he goes and tells this man not to sin anymore. He tells the adulterous woman to go and sin no more. There's absolutely truth, but there's also this grace where he extends love to them. And so for us, and our challenge, I think, for the day is, what is it that we're holding too tightly to that really isn't founded in Jesus? And are we, once again, I've mentioned this before, are we trying to bend God's will to our will, or are we willing to completely submit ourselves to whatever God's will is? See, I believe that's what we see Jesus doing as he lives his life here. And as we see even toward the end of his life, as we just celebrated Easter, that he was willing to say, "Not my will, but yours be done." If we look at the Lord's Prayer, it even says, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." It's all about us submitting ourselves to God's will. And I think it's what the Pharisees and Sadducees and other religious leaders are missing here. They're not worried about God's will. They're worried about everything being done by the little tiny the law, which is a huge deal, but by all breaking it all down, and they're not even allowing God to do work because of the law, the very one who gave them the law. It's just a challenge, just a thought. It's something for us to pray through today. Maybe as we shut down the video. God, what is it you want me to do? What is your will? What are the things I may be adding into this thing and it's pulling me off track from following you and the purity of your word? I hope that challenged you. I hope it encourages you. And I hope to see you again tomorrow as we journey through John.